At the funeral, the little girl suddenly pointed at her mother's coffin and kept shouting that her mother wasn't dead. When the police began their investigation, they were deeply shocked to uncover the truth. "She's not gone! She's not gone!" Haley's voice, shrill and shaking, broke through the heavy silence of the small chapel. Her words hung in the air like a thunderclap, jolting everyone out of their somber reverie. The 7-year-old darted toward the exit, a small figure disappearing through the doors before anyone could react. Richard Stevens froze, his hand gripping the back of a pew for support. He felt the weight of every eye in the room turn toward him, filled with questions he couldn't answer. His wife's funeral, a ceremony meant to bring closure, was now veiled in something darker. Richard cleared his throat, his voice hoarse as he addressed the murmuring crowd. "I'm so sorry. Haley's been struggling. She's just a child." His explanation felt weak, hollow, even to himself. His gaze lingered on the closed casket at the center of the room, the polished mahogany seeming to mock him with its silence. The days leading up to the funeral had been a blur for Richard. One moment, his wife Martha had been her usual vibrant self, planning their summer garden and laughing with Haley in the kitchen. The next, she was gone, dead from an apparent heart attack during her morning jog in the woods. "It doesn't make sense," he'd whispered to himself countless times since then. She'd been healthy, or at least he thought so. There'd been no warnings, no signs. When the coroner had called him to confirm her death, his shock had rendered him speechless. "Mr. Stevens," the voice on the other end had been firm, clinical, but something about it had felt off. "Under no circumstances should the casket be opened during the funeral. It's imperative for everyone's safety. Do you understand?" Richard had barely managed to stammer a response. The words had been strange, unsettling, but grief had dulled his ability to think critically. He'd nodded, agreed, and let the arrangements proceed as instructed. Now, standing in the chapel, with whispers swirling around him, he questioned every decision he'd made since that call. The whispers grew louder after the service as mourners gathered in small clusters outside the chapel. Friends and neighbors exchanged wary glances, their condolences giving way to speculation. "Why would they keep the casket closed?" one voice murmured. "Do you think it was an accident? Or something worse?" Richard, standing by the chapel doors, heard fragments of their conversations. His fists clenched at his sides, but he lacked the energy to confront them. His priority was Haley. He found her sitting on the porch steps of their house, her knees pulled to her chest. She stared into the distance, her face pale and streaked with dried tears. "Haley," Richard began softly, lowering himself to her level. "I know this is hard. I miss her, too." She didn't look at him. "She's not gone, Daddy. I saw her." Her words were steady, firm, as though she believed them with every fiber of her being. "Sweetheart." He hesitated, unsure how to handle her conviction. "Sometimes, when we lose someone, it feels like they're still here. That's just how our minds try to protect us." Haley finally turned to him, her eyes blazing with frustration. "No, I saw her. Through the window 2 nights ago. She was standing in the woods watching the house." Richard's breath caught. He wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to a child's imagination, or the cruel tricks grief could play on the mind. But the certainty in her voice made it impossible to ignore. "Haley, that's not possible," he said gently, though doubt began to gnaw at the edges of his thoughts. "It is. She was wearing her blue hoodie, the one she always wears when it's cold. She looked right at me." Haley's voice cracked, her frustration giving way to desperation. "Why won't you believe me?" Richard didn't answer Haley right away. He couldn't. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, and for a moment he just sat there, staring at her tear-streaked face. His mind raced, flipping through memories of Martha, her laugh, her warmth, the way she used to pull that blue hoodie tight around her on chilly mornings. But she was gone, wasn't she? He reached out, his hand trembling, and brushed a strand of Haley's hair away from her face. "Honey," he began softly, his voice heavy with both love and doubt. "Sometimes our minds, they play tricks on us, especially when we're sad. It makes us see things we wish were real." Haley pulled away from his touch, her face hardening. "It wasn't my mind playing tricks, Daddy. It was her. I know it." Her voice was low, her words sharp and deliberate. Then, with the kind of finality only a child can muster, she turned on her heel and stormed upstairs, leaving Richard sitting alone in the silence. That night, sleep didn't come easily for him. The house felt too big, too empty, every creak and groan of the wood floors amplified in the dark. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying Haley's words over and over. He tried to convince himself she was just a grieving child, her imagination heightened by the trauma of losing her mother. But a part of him, small and persistent, kept whispering that maybe she wasn't imagining things. The coroner's odd phone call drifted back into his mind. Under no circumstances should the casket be opened. The words were clipped, cold, and they'd unsettled him at the time, though he hadn't pressed for answers. Now, they seemed almost sinister. What if Haley was right? The next morning, Victor Rowland showed up unannounced, his presence both a relief and a reminder of the unanswered questions hanging over Richard's head. "Figured I'd drop by," Victor said, stepping inside and brushing the early autumn chill off his coat. His voice carried that no-nonsense tone Richard had always appreciated, even when it grated on him. "Thought you might need someone to talk to." Richard hesitated before nodding. Yeah, I could use that." Victor's eyes scanned the room, taking in the half-empty coffee mug on the table, the stack of unopened mail, and the general disarray that had taken over the house since Martha's death. He didn't say anything, but Richard could feel his silent judgment. "Haley's been saying some strange things," Richard admitted, pouring them both a fresh cup of coffee. Victor took the mug, leaning against the counter. "Strange how?" Richard hesitated, not sure how much he wanted to share. Finally, he sighed and said, "She thinks she saw Martha. Says she was standing outside the window a couple nights ago." Victor's brows furrowed, his expression unreadable. "Kids grieve in their own way," he said carefully. "Sometimes they see what they want to see." "That's what I told her," Richard said, rubbing a hand over his face. "But she's so certain. It's like she knows something I don't." Victor was quiet for a moment, sipping his coffee. Then he said, "Do you?" Richard blinked. "Do I what?" "Know something she doesn't," Victor said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. "Anything about Martha's death that doesn't add up." The question hung in the air, heavy and unwelcome. Richard opened his mouth to deny it, to say that everything was normal, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself saying, "The coroner, he insisted the casket stay closed, said it was for everyone's safety." Victor's eyes narrowed. "For safety? That's not standard procedure." "I know," Richard said, his voice trembling, "but I didn't ask questions. I couldn't handle it. And now, with what Haley said..." Victor set his mug down on the counter with a soft clink. "You're telling me you didn't see the body?" Richard shook his head, shame burning in his chest. No. They told me it was a heart attack, and I believed them. Victor's expression darkened, a mix of concern and suspicion clouding his features. And you didn't think that was odd? That they wouldn't let you see her? I wasn't thinking, Victor, Richard snapped, his voice cracking. I'd just lost my wife. I wasn't myself. Victor held up his hands in a gesture of calm. All right, I get it. But listen to me, Richard. This doesn't sit right with me. I think we need to look into it. Richard's stomach churned. You think they lied to me? I don't know, Victor said. But I've got a gut feeling, and it's telling me there's more to this than what we've been told. That evening, after Victor left, Richard sat by the window, staring out into the darkened woods. The wind rustled the trees, and for a moment he thought he saw movement, a shadow slipping between the trunks. He blinked, and it was gone. Shaking his head, he turned away from the window. He was letting Haley's words get to him, letting Victor's suspicions plant seeds of doubt where there shouldn't be any. The next morning, Victor Rowland parked his car outside the county morgue, its concrete walls looming like an unspoken reminder of life's impermanence. He exhaled deeply, gripping the steering wheel for a moment longer than necessary. His instincts, sharpened by years in law enforcement, told him he wasn't walking into just another routine inquiry. Inside, the air was sterile, the smell of disinfectant mingling with a faint, unshakable chill. Victor approached the reception desk, where a young woman in scrubs looked up with polite detachment. "Detective Rowland," he said, flashing his badge. "I need to speak with Dr. Anderson. He was the coroner for Martha Stevens's case." Her brows knitted in confusion. "Dr. Anderson?" she repeated, flipping through a clipboard. "I think there's been a mistake. Dr. Anderson retired." "Oh, 3 years ago. Are you sure you've got the right name?" Victor's jaw tightened. 3 years, you say? Then who signed the death certificate for Martha Stevens? She hesitated, then typed into the computer. "Dr. Jennifer Clark. She's been handling all cases since Anderson left." Victor nodded, his mind racing. "Can I speak with her?" "I'll see if she's available." The receptionist disappeared down a corridor, leaving Victor to stew in the eerie quiet of the morgue lobby. 15 minutes later, Victor was sitting across from Dr. Clark in her stark, windowless office. She was a composed woman, middle-aged, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Detective Rowland?" she began, leaning forward slightly. "What's this about Martha Stevens?" Victor chose his words carefully. "Her death was ruled a heart attack, correct?" Dr. Clark nodded. "That's right. Brought in as a sudden cardiac arrest. I didn't personally examine the body, but my team handled the case." "And Dr. Anderson? Was he involved in any way?" Her brows furrowed. "As I said, Anderson retired years ago. He hasn't been in this office since." Victor leaned back, his gut churning. So why would her husband, Richard Stevens, have received a phone call from someone claiming to be Anderson, insisting the casket stay closed during the funeral? Dr. Clark's face shifted, a flicker of unease crossing her features. "I'm sorry, Detective, but I can't explain that. If someone contacted Mr. Stevens under Anderson's name, that's highly irregular." "Did anyone else handle the case who shouldn't have?" Victor pressed. "No," Clark said firmly. "Martha Stevens's case was straightforward. No autopsy was required, given the circumstances." Victor didn't reply immediately, letting her words sink in. "I'll need to review all the records for her case," he said finally, his voice steady but resolute. Dr. Clark hesitated, then nodded. "I'll have them sent to you." As Victor drove away from the morgue, the nagging feeling in his chest grew stronger. A retired coroner's name, a closed casket, and a grieving husband who hadn't seen his wife's body. None of it added up. That evening he called Richard. "Anything new?" Richard's voice sounded strained, as though the weight of his grief had only grown heavier. "You could say that," Victor replied. "I went to the morgue. Turns out Anderson hasn't been there for years. The coroner who signed the death certificate didn't even examine Martha's body herself." "Something's off, Richard." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, in a quieter voice, Richard said, "What does that mean?" "It means," Victor said carefully, "we need to figure out who's lying and why." The next day, Haley's insistence about seeing her mother near the woods refused to leave Victor's mind. After dropping by Richard's house and speaking with Haley again, he decided to see the path for himself. It was late afternoon when he parked his car near the trail Haley often took to school. The woods stretched out before him, dense and shadowy, the kind of place that seemed alive with secrets. Victor moved quietly, his boots crunching against fallen leaves. He kept his eyes sharp, scanning for anything unusual. About half a mile in, he saw something, or rather, someone. A figure, dressed in a grey hoodie and dark pants, lingered near the edge of the path. They kept their back to him, moving slowly, almost deliberately, as though trying to avoid being noticed. Victor froze, his pulse quickening. "Excuse me," he called out. The figure stiffened, then darted into the trees without a word. "Hey, stop!" Victor shouted, giving chase. The figure was quick, weaving through the trees with practiced ease. Victor pushed himself to keep up, his heart pounding as branches snagged at his jacket. Finally, he broke through a thicket and found himself at the edge of a clearing. In the center stood a small, weathered cabin, its windows dark and its door slightly ajar. Victor crouched low, his chest heaving as he scanned the cabin from the cover of the trees. The quiet of the woods pressed in around him, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. His hand hovered near his sidearm, though he hadn't drawn it. Yet. He couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had run inside was still watching him, just as he was watching them. The door creaked open slightly, and Victor caught a glimpse of movement, a flash of a figure crossing in front of the cabin's single dirty window. He shifted his position to get a better view, his heart thudding in his chest. And then he saw her. The hoodie was gone now, and though her hair was shorter and dyed an inky black, the way she moved, the slight tilt of her head, it was unmistakable. It was Martha. Victor swallowed hard, his instincts warring with his emotions. Martha Stevens, the woman whose death certificate he'd read, the woman whose funeral he'd attended, was alive. He reached for his phone, hesitating for a moment before hitting record. His camera lens focused on the cabin's window as Martha came into full view. She was pacing, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her expression a mix of anguish and determination. A second figure emerged from the shadows. Man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that carried the hardened lines of someone accustomed to evading the law. He placed a hand on Martha's shoulder, and though his words were muffled, his tone was urgent. Victor crept closer, careful to stay low. His boots crunched softly against the forest floor, and he cursed under his breath, freezing every time the sound threatened to give him away. The voices grew clearer as he neared the cabin's side window. "We have to go," the man said, his voice low but firm. "Staying here isn't safe anymore. They'll figure it out, Elsa." "Elsa." Victor's brow furrowed. "I can't leave her, Scott." "Martha." Elsa spoke, her voice trembling. "Haley needs me. I can't just disappear again." Scott's voice hardened. "You don't have a choice. You knew this was going to happen. They're getting too close. You think they'll care about your reasons if they find us." Martha, or Elsa, took a shaky breath, her back to the window now. Victor strained to hear as she whispered, "She's my daughter, Scott. She deserves better than this. Better than me." Scott stepped closer, gripping her shoulders and shaking her gently. "She deserves to grow up without a target on her back, Elsa. If you stay, you're putting her in danger. You know that." Victor's grip on his phone tightened. Every fiber of his being wanted to kick in the door and demand answers, but he forced himself to stay hidden. He needed more evidence, more clarity. Inside, Martha sank into a chair, her head in her hands. "I thought I could outrun it," she said softly. "Start over. But it's never going to stop, is it?" Scott crouched in front of her, his voice softening. "Not unless we end it, but that means cutting ties, completely. It's the only way." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Victor's mind raced as he processed what he'd just heard. A new name, a new identity, and a life lived in hiding. Martha wasn't just running, she was running from something or someone far bigger than he'd imagined. Victor waited until the cabin fell silent, the light inside dimming as the pair retreated to another room. He slipped back into the woods, his breath shallow and his pulse racing. Every step away from the clearing felt heavier than the last, the weight of what he'd seen pressing down on him. Once he was back in his car, he sat in the driver's seat, staring at the recording on his phone. The evidence was clear. Martha was alive, and she was in serious trouble. But what now? Victor's first instinct was to call Richard, to let him know the truth. But as he thumbed through his contacts, he paused. How could he tell his friend that the wife he'd mourned was not only alive, but had also deceived him? And what about Haley? How could a child process something like this? No, Victor thought, pocketing his phone. Richard deserved answers, but not like this. Not until Victor had the full picture. That night, back at his apartment, Victor reviewed the video again. He replayed the conversation over and over, parsing every word for clues. Elsa. The name felt foreign on his tongue, and yet it fit her new appearance in a way Martha never had. Scott was clearly her brother, or claimed to be. But what were they running from? He jotted down notes, his handwriting scrawled and uneven. Why fake her death? Who's after her? Connection to Richard and Haley? As he stared at the questions, a pang of guilt twisted in his chest. He wasn't just uncovering a mystery, he was unraveling the life of someone he'd once considered a friend. But the truth wouldn't wait. Victor leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. He had no choice but to dig deeper, no matter what he found, and no matter who got hurt. The plan was set by dawn. Victor stood by his car, his breath visible in the early morning chill, speaking quietly into his radio. "We move on my signal," he said, his voice steady. "No noise, no sudden moves unless we're forced to. Understood?" A series of quiet affirmatives came through the receiver. Victor's eyes remained fixed on the dirt trail leading to the cabin, its faint outline barely visible through the fog. He didn't like this. Not the setup, not the stakes, and certainly not the people involved. But there was no turning back now. The cabin, nestled deep in the woods, had to be surrounded. 4 officers moved silently into position, their shadows blending with the trees. Victor followed behind, his footsteps careful, his every sense on high alert. Inside, the dim light of a lantern flickered through the grimy window. Victor raised a hand, signaling the others to hold their positions. He strained to hear anything from within, voices, movement, anything that might give them a clue about what to expect. A low murmur reached his ears. 2 voices, one male and one female, their words indistinct but tense. "They're still here," Victor whispered into his radio. "Wait for my mark." He approached the cabin slowly, his heart pounding with each step. He glanced back at Officer Henson, who nodded, his rifle at the ready. Victor reached the porch, his hand brushing against the rough wooden railing. With one final breath, he stepped forward and pushed the door open. "Police! Don't move!" The room erupted into chaos. Scott bolted upright from his chair, his hands instantly reaching for the pistol tucked into his waistband. "Don't even think about it," Victor barked, his own weapon aimed squarely at Scott's chest. Elsa, froze where she stood, her face pale and etched with exhaustion. Her hands slowly raised, trembling slightly as she glanced between Victor and Scott. "Scott, don't," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Please, it's over." But Scott wasn't listening. His eyes darted toward the back door, calculating. He lunged, pushing over a chair in the process, and made a break for it. "Stop!" Victor shouted, but Scott was already out the door, crashing into the underbrush. "Henson, go!" Victor yelled into his radio, and the officer bolted after Scott, the sound of their pursuit fading into the woods. Victor turned back to Martha, his gun still raised. "Don't move," he said, his tone firm but less aggressive now. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She sank into the chair Scott had abandoned, her hands still raised, her eyes avoiding his. Victor lowered his weapon slightly, but his grip remained tight. "Elsa Forrester," he said, testing the name he'd overheard just days before. "That is your name, isn't it?" She didn't answer immediately. When she finally met his gaze, her expression was a mixture of defiance and despair. "I didn't mean for it to end like this." Richard stared through the 2-way glass, his reflection faintly superimposed over the woman sitting in the interrogation room. His fists clenched at his sides, nails biting into his palms. It was her. There was no mistaking it. Her posture, her expression, the way she held her hands as if trying to shrink into herself. It was Martha. No, not Martha. Elsa. The name churned in his mind, foreign and bitter, like something he wasn't meant to know. "Do you want to go in?" Victor's voice was calm, steady, a lifeline in the storm of Richard's thoughts. "I don't know what I want," Richard replied, his voice hoarse. His eyes never left the glass. Victor placed a hand on his shoulder, a quiet gesture of support. "Whatever you decide, she's ready to talk. About everything." Richard let out a shaky breath, then nodded. The room was colder than he expected, or maybe it was just him. As he stepped inside, Martha, Elsa, looked up. Their eyes met, and for a moment the years between them seemed to dissolve. "Richard," she whispered, her voice breaking. He stopped just short of the table, his jaw tightening. "I don't even know what to call you anymore." Her face crumpled and she looked down at her hands, the cuffs around her wrists glinting under the harsh fluorescent light. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "For everything." "Sorry?" Richard's voice rose and he took a step closer. "You're sorry. You let us think you were dead. You let our daughter—" His voice cracked, and he turned away, running a hand through his hair. "I had to protect you," she said quickly, desperately. "Both of you. It was the only way. Protect us from what? He spun back to face her, his eyes blazing. You could have come to me. We could have figured it out together. But no, you just disappeared. You broke our family, Martha. She flinched at the name but didn't correct him. Instead, she stared at him with a mixture of guilt and longing. You don't understand, she said softly. They would have killed me, Richard. And then they would have come for you. For Haley. Who? He demanded. Who are these people you're so afraid of? She hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door as if someone might burst in at any moment. It's complicated, she began, her voice faltering. I wasn't honest about my past. Before you, before Haley, I was involved with people, dangerous people. I thought I could leave it behind, but they found me. And faking your death was the solution? Richard's tone dripped with sarcasm. You could have trusted me, Martha. You should have trusted me. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. I didn't want to drag you into it. I didn't want you and Haley to pay for my mistakes. The door opened and Victor stepped in, his expression somber. Richard, he said quietly. Haley's here. She wants to see her. Richard froze. Haley's here? Victor nodded. She insisted, said she needed to talk to her mum. Martha's breath hitched and she leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Please, she said, her voice cracking. Let me see her, just for a minute. Richard looked at Victor, his face a storm of emotions. Finally, he nodded. Haley's footsteps were hesitant as she entered the room, her small frame seeming even smaller under the weight of the moment. Her eyes locked onto Martha, and for a moment she just stood there, silent and wide-eyed. Mama, she whispered, her voice trembling. Martha's face broke into a tearful smile, and she reached out as far as her cuffs would allow. Haley, my sweet girl. Haley ran to her, throwing her arms around her mother. Martha's hands cupped the back of her daughter's head, her tears falling freely now. I'm so sorry, baby, Martha whispered. I never wanted to leave you. I love you more than anything in this world. Haley pulled back just enough to look at her mother's face, her own tears streaming. Why did you go? Why didn't you stay with us? Martha's heart broke at the pain in her daughter's voice. Because I thought it was the only way to keep you safe, she said, her voice shaking. But I see now. I see now that I hurt you. And I'm so sorry, Haley. I never stopped loving you. Not for a second. Victor watched from behind the glass, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The scene unfolding before him was almost too much to bear. He glanced at Richard, who stood beside him, silent and unmoving. You did the right thing bringing her here, Victor said softly. Richard didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Did I? Look at her. Look at what this has done to her. Victor had no answer for that. Back in the room, Martha pressed her forehead to Haley's. You have to be strong for me. Okay. For your daddy? Can you do that? Haley sniffled, nodding. But I don't want you to go. Martha's tears fell harder. I don't want to go either, sweetheart, but I'll always love you. Always. Victor stepped in then, his presence a quiet but firm reminder that their time was up. Mama, Haley said as she was gently led away. Don't forget me. Never, Martha whispered, her voice breaking. Never. As the door closed behind her daughter, Martha's head sank to the table, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The house felt quieter than ever when Richard and Haley returned. Not the kind of quiet that brought peace, but a heavy, stifling silence that clung to every corner. Richard sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had long gone cold. Hayley stood in the doorway, watching him, her small face pale and drawn. "Daddy," she said softly, her voice tentative. He looked up, startled, as if he'd forgotten she was there. "Yeah, sweetheart. I'm going to go upstairs," she said. I just need to be alone for a bit." He nodded, watching as she padded toward the stairs. "All right. Let me know if you need anything." She didn't respond, and he listened to her footsteps fade. Once they were gone, the quiet rushed back in, heavier than before. Hayley sat cross-legged on her bed, a blank notebook open in front of her. She'd found it in the back of her desk drawer, something her mum, no, Martha, she corrected herself, had bought for her last year. It was pink with little gold stars on the cover, and she'd never used it before. Now, she picked up a pen and stared at the empty page, unsure where to start. Her heart felt too full, too tangled, like a knot she couldn't undo. Finally, she wrote, "Dear Diary, I don't know how to feel anymore. Mama, Martha, she said she loved me. But if she did, why would she lie? Why would she leave?" The words came slowly at first, but once they started, they wouldn't stop. She poured everything out. The confusion, the anger, the sadness. When she finished, her hand was cramped, and the page was streaked where her tears had smudged the ink. Downstairs, Richard stared at the photos on the mantel. There was one of Martha holding Hayley as a baby, both of them laughing, their faces lit with pure joy. He'd always loved that picture. Now, it felt like a cruel joke. How had he not seen it? The cracks in the story, the lies hidden in plain sight. He'd prided himself on being a good husband, a good father, and yet he hadn't even known the truth about his own wife. The knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. For a second he considered ignoring it, but the knock came again, insistent. When he opened the door, Victor stood there, looking as worn as Richard felt. "Thought I'd check in," Victor said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. He glanced around the living room, taking in the scattered mail, the empty coffee cup on the table. "How are you holding up?" Richard let out a humorless laugh. "How do you think?" Victor nodded, his face serious. "Look, I know this is a lot, but you've got to keep it together, for Hayley, if nothing else." Richard sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. "I don't know if I can, Victor. She's asking questions I don't have answers to. And the neighbors. The way they look at us now, like we're some kind of sideshow freaks." Victor sat down beside him, his tone quiet but firm. "People talk. They'll forget eventually, move on to the next piece of gossip. But Hayley, she's not going to forget. She needs you now more than ever." "I know," Richard murmured, his voice breaking. I feel like I failed her. I didn't see it, Victor. I didn't see what Martha was hiding. What kind of father does that make me?" "The kind who trusted his wife," Victor said, simply. "Don't beat yourself up for that. You did the best you could with what you knew." Richard didn't reply. He just stared at the floor, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his guilt. Richard made the decision that night, after Victor left and the silence of the house settled in again. Hayley needed a break, a real one. And truthfully, so did he. The weight of everything was too much, too heavy to carry in a place filled with whispers and memories. The next morning, over breakfast, he broached the idea. "What do you think about taking a trip?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light. Hayley looked up from her cereal, her spoon hovering in midair. A trip? Where? Some place quiet, Richard said. Just the two of us. Get away from everything for a while. She studied him for a moment as though trying to gauge if he was serious. Then she nodded slowly. Okay. The small cabin they rented sat at the edge of a sprawling meadow, framed by a dense line of pines. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers and the sound of a nearby stream. It was everything Richard had hoped for, simple, peaceful, and far removed from the noise of their everyday lives. Haley seemed to relax almost immediately. On their first evening, she wandered outside with a sketch pad, sitting cross-legged on a weathered log as she drew the trees. Richard watched from the porch, a small smile tugging at his lips. He didn't interrupt her. He didn't need to. Just seeing her lost in something other than the weight of their shared pain was enough. By the second day, Haley began asking questions Richard had known would come but had no idea how to answer. "Daddy," she said, perched on a rock near the stream, her hands trailing in the cool water. "Why didn't Mama tell us the truth?" Richard paused, the fishing line in his hands going slack. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. I think she thought she was protecting us." "Protecting us from what?" Haley frowned. "She didn't have to lie. We would have helped her." "I know," Richard said softly. "But sometimes grown-ups, we think we're doing the right thing, even when it ends up hurting the people we love." Haley was quiet for a moment, her eyes fixed on the rippling water. "Do you think she really loved us?" Richard set the fishing rod aside and moved to sit beside her. "Of course she did," he said, his voice firm. "I don't think she ever stopped loving us. She just got scared. And sometimes when people are scared, they make mistakes." Haley nodded slowly, though her expression remained pensive. "I wish she'd told us. I wish she'd stayed." Richard put an arm around her, pulling her close. "Me too, sweetie. Me too." One afternoon, as Haley explored the meadow, she stumbled across something unexpected. It was a small, faded envelope, tucked into the pages of one of the books she'd brought from home. Her name was written on the front in her mother's neat handwriting. "Daddy," she called, running back to the cabin with the envelope clutched tightly in her hand. Richard looked up from where he was chopping vegetables for dinner. "What is it?" She held out the envelope, her eyes wide. "It's from Mama." Richard froze, his heart skipping a beat. He took the envelope from her carefully, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the words written in the same familiar hand. Haley leaned against him as he read aloud. "My dearest Haley, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you. I want you to know that I love you more than anything in this world, and everything I've ever done has been to keep you safe. I know it might not make sense right now, and it might never make sense, but I hope you'll understand someday. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, and I will always be proud of you. Love always, Mama." By the time he finished, Haley's cheeks were streaked with tears. "She did love us," she whispered, clutching the letter to her chest. "She did," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "She always did." Meanwhile, back in town, Victor was digging deeper into Elsa Forrester's past. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that Martha, Elsa, had been running from something far darker than anyone had realized. Old records pointed to a tangled web of organized crime, dangerous alliances, and a life that seemed worlds away from the woman Richard had married. As Victor sifted through the files, a sense of unease settled over him. He'd made the right call in arresting her. He was sure of that. But knowing what he now knew, he couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. Elsa's life had been a ticking time bomb, and she'd done everything she could to shield her family from the fallout. Still, it didn't change the damage left in her wake. When Richard and Haley returned home, the air felt different, lighter somehow. The trip had given them a chance to reconnect, to start piecing their lives back together. Richard signed up for counseling, determined to face his guilt head-on and be the father Haley needed. He started small, reaching out to friends and neighbors, letting them back into his life bit by bit. Haley, too, began to heal. She threw herself into her schoolwork, determined to excel in a way that would make her mother proud. The letter became her talisman, a reminder of the love that had always been there, even when it was buried under layers of secrecy. And Victor? He stayed close, checking in often, becoming the steady presence Richard and Haley both needed. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, Richard and Haley stood by the lake, their reflections shimmering on the water's surface. "Daddy?" Haley said, her voice soft. "Yeah? Do you think we'll be okay?" Richard smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I think we will, sweetie. I think we will." And as the last light of the day faded, they stood there together, finding strength in each other and in the promise of a new beginning. This story is a gripping exploration of love, loss, and resilience, intricately woven through the emotional journeys of its characters. Richard's path from betrayal and guilt to acceptance and healing is deeply moving. As a father, he faces immense pressure to protect Haley while grappling with his own heartbreak over Martha's lies. His decision to prioritize Haley's emotional well-being, despite his internal turmoil, reflects his strength and unconditional love. Haley's journey is equally poignant. Despite her tender age, she wrestles with complex emotions of abandonment, confusion, and anger. Her discovery of her mother's letter becomes a turning point, allowing her to reconcile Martha's actions with the love that motivated them. It's a testament to the resilience of a child's heart and the power of forgiveness. Victor's role as an investigator and friend adds depth, showing how loyalty and morality often clash in life's toughest moments. The story teaches a profound lesson about the inevitability of the past and the strength it takes to confront it. It reminds us that even in the face of betrayal, love and forgiveness can pave the way for healing. Ultimately, it's a tale about the enduring bonds of family and the courage to start anew. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and share it. Leave a comment to tell us how it inspired you, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. May God bless you and be with you every step of the way.